welcome to this edition of the Eric Miscoll Show. I'm Eric Miscoll with EMS Now. Thanks for joining us. As always, I have Phil Stoughton on to make us all sound smarter because he has a British accent, and that plays well. That said, let me introduce our guests. We've done the topic today is getting an update on the material supply chain. Joining us today again are Jeff Ray. He's the Senior Vice President of Global Accounts with TTI. And we have Dale Ford, who's the Chief Analyst with ECIA, the Electronics Component Industry Association. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us again and agreeing to come on and share your thoughts and views on the industry with us. Before we get into all the data, and we do have a lot from ECIA from their recent conference, I thought I'd start kind of big picture with you, Jeff. Just kind of get an assessment. You deal with a lot of companies, and so what's your assessment of kind of the electronic component industry as we're heading into the final months of 2024? Where do we stand?
Thank you, Eric, and it certainly is my pleasure to be here. I guess where we stand is maybe start with wrong again. It didn't have a back half of 23 recovery. It didn't have a back half of 24 recovery either. And so the recovery pace is a little slower than expected, or what was projected. Some of the causal factors of the slowness of recovery can be attributed to several things. Chief among those, the amount of inventory that's in the channel, whether it be at EMS accounts, OEM accounts, at the original component manufacturers, or certainly within distribution. And so any momentum that's been created or green shoots of opportunity largely outside data centers or those types of applications in IT datacom have been thwarted by the amount of inventory that's still in the channel. We are seeing some, I say stability in the Americas. It's fundamentally at 2023 levels, consistent from that standpoint, which is above pre-COVID. So when I give some data later on in the presentation, we'll talk about what it was like pre-COVID, because I don't know where to benchmark off of post-COVID, and it's been a little bit of a roller coaster ride there. We're starting to see improvement in Asia, which is very encouraging, and but unfortunately, still seeing quite a bit of a decline in Europe. And at this point, I'm not sure that I would forecast any growth at all in Europe in 2025. I think we're finding that the European market, particularly the DACH region, is heavily dependent upon the Chinese economy, and with inflation and the products that go into factory automation or smart building, it's really been difficult without the additional factory expansions. And again, with the economy and interest rates, it's really impacted those segments and sub-segments pretty hard. And so, I hate to say it, but I think that where we are right now is at least 2 quarters more of what we're dealing with today. There are some economists and industry experts that are projecting, first half of 2025. But as I look at the fundamentals, I don't believe it. I think we're looking at 2025 back half, and most of that is predicated on a strengthening pull from the vertical markets to pull the inventory out to get the overall economic and electronics industry restarted. We're seeing flatness now in automotive and actually declining. Now, I count EV charging sometimes in automotive. You can also count EV charging in industrial. Where does it transition? Certainly at the connectors, it plugs into the automotive. But in either rate, EV applications are not at the same projections that they once were. Even in Germany, they're seeing a slowing of EV charging infrastructure. I think it's a little bit of a pipe dream. Maybe it's because I live in Texas, but I'm not sure that the U.S. is ready for the EV market again, the way that it's projected, and
Yeah.
so that's slowing the overall piece there. The hybrid versions, I think, are going to win out over internal combustion or pure EV. And so I think many of the manufacturers are having to repivot there, which is just delaying some programs and things of that nature, particularly in the automotive space. We've talked about industrial outside datacom. It's pretty flat as well. When you look at the data centers, that is the white hot application, and it's starting to cause a little bit of impact on lead times of critical components to go into those applications. We talk about those as well. When you look at the mil aero, after several quarters of strength, we're starting to see that start to slow down as well. I think the description was lumpy. I'm not sure what lumpy means relative to the market, but let's just say that there's some slowness happening in some of the programs in that market as well. And then, of course, the EMS, bringing it back home, that provide to those industries, also seeing some slowness. Part of that is due to the inventory that they're sitting on, albeit when you go back to pre-COVID, and I won't name the EMS partners, but the top five, only one are back to pre-COVID levels from days of inventory. Others are at least 15 days more inventory than they were going into COVID. Most are about 30 days more of inventory. So that's going to take some more time to average out. And you're looking at days of inventories in the mid 70s to mid 60 ranges. And so you're going to need to see that number come down a little bit more. And then another thing that's challenging, again, from an order book perspective, is interest rates. Now, most of these global EMS partners are paying or have expense interest rates. It is twice what it was going into COVID. Now, that doesn't mean that they owe twice as much money, but given the interest rates, they are paying twice as much, which is just a burden on their cash flow, and it makes it harder for them to advance order, create order books because they're having to take reserves against those commitments. And I think all this is building to is that there's going to be a suddenness to some of the sub verticals, and as we start to pivot, unfortunately, we as an industry we pivot pretty quickly, but we also tend to over rotate. And so we've gone from no inventory to now going to need inventory. And with the manufacturers doing some things, whether it be personnel, we have some manufacturers, particularly in industrial interconnect space, that have reduced capacity, which drives lead times out a little bit. I'm not predicting a perfect storm or anything like that. That's not the point of it. But I do think that we need to be aware that lead times are a historical looking index, if you will, and I'm very dubious about the accuracy of those lead times today, particularly on lines that are not at full capacity as they start to ramp back up. But that is the indicator that distributors and EMS alike use in their order book management. So I think that we're not where we used to be, but we're not where we want to be. And I think that we've got at least 2 more quarters of this type of pressure on the order book. I tell people we're either chasing orders or chasing parts. I think by the back half of next year, we may be back in the part chasing business again, which is
what?
where we're be.
Yeah, you know what, Jeff, 10 minutes, we can wrap up there. You've learned everything you need to learn about exactly what's going on in the supply chain. That was a really clear picture. Thank you for that. It's interesting that it does concur with what I heard at the recent IPC EMS seminar in Gdansk, where Dieter Weiss from Informa presented the numbers. And when you talk about having to benchmark to pre-COVID, it is kind of an unprecedented event that we haven't seen before. And anybody that was using AI models to predict stock and things like that had problems during COVID because, it was a totally unpredictable event. And we have created this huge inventory bubble, bullwhip effect that definitely hasn't settled, and that will have some that will be lumpy going forward, as you put it. I think that's a clear trend. The other thing that Dieter made absolutely clear is the market doesn't jump. And when you look at the growth that many companies had in 22 and 23 or early 23, clearly unsustainable and clearly not part of the last 15 years of CAGR that the market had seen. So there has to be a reaction to that growth and a kind of a settlement back in. And having spoke to a lot of people in the last 2 to 3 months, I think your suggestion that recovery is mid 2025 at best and more likely late 2025 seems to concur. On top of that, you've had US election and you've had so many other elections this year that also causes a little bit of a delay in capex, so that slows people down. Is that something that you think has had much of an impact? And do you think everybody, my sense is everybody wants the election in their rearview mirror rather than looming on the horizon. Do you think that has much effect?
It's hard to tell if it's had any impact, but I can definitely concur that we're all ready for it to be in the rearview mirror.
Yeah, I would agree. Listen, let's pull Dale in. Dale, you recently you did the ECIA conference here this month. You presented a lot of data there about the industry based on your analysis. So kind of give us the highlights and kind of how you're assessing the current state of the industry.
Well, I'm very much aligned with Jeff. As he was making his comments, nodding along in agreement with his assessment of what's taking place out there. Maybe add a couple of elements to that. It is interesting. One of the slides I shared last week was that it's interesting. We still have the stubborn inventory overhang problem that Jeff talked about. And one of the inconsistent elements to that is that our lead times on average are still notably above where they were pre-COVID. So, as we measure lead times, probably the ones in the best shape is passives, where it's, we're on average overall about 8% above where we were pre-COVID. Whereas in electromechanical and semiconductors, we're more in the 20% range above where we were in COVID. The good news is that as we measure it and we track it with our trusted parts database, even with weekly resolution, over the last, year and a half since we've been tracking that, we see consistent decline in the lead times, with one exception, which is interesting that Jeff mentioned the connectors, the electromechanical world. That's the one area where we've actually seen more last few months an increase in lead times in that area. So that's the one counter trend, I guess you could say, is there, and it may be having to do with the manufacturing capacity and how they're working to manage that. So we are seeing the lead times come down. The other concern that I heard last week at our conference, a number of people expressed, in addition to the inventory, and having to work it off, is we're coming up now on some date code restrictions that could start coming into play. We've got that inventory that's been sitting out there, and we're going to start feeling some pressure with regard to, stale inventory sitting there and needing to take action with it one way or another. And so that may be interesting to see how people manage through that added, should we say, layer of challenge that we're facing right now with those date code restrictions. I don't have data on that, but it's just something that I heard come up in multiple conversations that I was a part of last week. The other key thing that I emphasized is the recovery, at least in revenues at this point, is significantly driven by ASPs, not by unit shipments. Now, and you see how that changes different submarkets. Now, if we look at passives, inductors, are really doing quite well compared to capacitors and resistors. And a good share of that, again, related to ASPs in that area. But perhaps where you see more resolution is in semiconductors. You know, we look at the top line and go, wow, look at semiconductors. They're performing so well. Well, that performance is related to DRAM and flash, more specifically HBM memory that's going into these data centers. We're unprecedented 160% quarter over quarter the prior year growth in DRAM data flash, just staggering growth. So that's driving the top line, of course. The other element is application-specific logic ICs / NVIDIA and what they're doing. And MPUs have been doing relatively well. They've kind of come down off their performance levels as well. So those are the only three areas that are doing well. If you look at analog ICs, discrete components, you know, sensors, you go down the line, those areas have been harmed because the ASPs are not giving those areas a boost. We see a big boost in ASPs for memory and logic products. And if you look at the total semiconductor line, shipments of all types of semiconductors are just a little bit above flat. All of the growth at the top line is attributable to the ASPs. And ASPs are actually creating a drag in a number of these component categories like analog ICs and discretes and whatnot. So even though we do have some areas that are starting to pick up with unit shipments, until we can get stabilized or maybe even a slight increase in some of the pricing trends, it's going to be a tough journey. And so you have to pay attention to what's taking place there. So it's the combination that you have to look at, shipments and pricing and how that's playing out into the marketplace. So those are some items that I think you have to pay attention to as well. But overall, you know, very much, again, the data that I'm seeing, that we're gathering, very much supports what Jeff's assessment is. The one thing I will share is that at our conference last week, we had a great economist, Alex Chasovsky, who came and presented. And he had a very bright, encouraging future ahead of us economically. And it was a bit hard to follow. I was like, well, gosh, now you got the good news. Now I get to bring in the bad news. But I guess perhaps the encouraging thing is if we can work to drive this recovery in at least a solid surrounding economic environment, that will help. I've always felt that a solid economy is a necessary but not sufficient key to driving an up cycle in our industry. And so if we can at least get that necessary element in place of a more solid economic picture, that will help us moving forward also.
Very good.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of those things we've talked about in terms of the inventory bubble, in terms of raised interest rates, they're things that are cyclical, or they're things that relate, particularly with inventory, relate to what happened in the pandemic. And the underlying trend is more electronics in more parts of our lives, more AI, more data centers, an explosion in data centers, an explosion in the energy required for data centers, hopefully a lot of which will be sustainable and hence have quite a bit of electronics in. So I think everybody believes the underlying trends are strong. It's just how we get past this kind of back end of the bullwhip effect, and how quickly interest rates come down perhaps and settles. On the last EMS and the Economist show with Sean DeBravac, Sean suggested that he thought there might be 5 rate cuts in the next 12 months, but that they'd probably only be 25 points, which is, only 1.25% less, which still leaves the interest rates at the end of next year much higher than they were, as you said, Jeff, pre-pandemic. So, some challenges there. I think the other challenge that I see from the EMS guys is just the lack of predictability in the market, and they're almost stuck in the middle because they're feeling that from both sides. They feel they don't have predictability in terms of what they're going to be able to get to build stuff, and they don't have predictability in demand in what they need to build. So, and they're not traditionally a industry that can crank up the ramp and crank it back down by 20 to 40% quickly. They can make small adjustments, but big adjustments are really hard. So I think that's part of the challenge they see when they're in a year like they've had this year, and they don't quite know what's going to happen next year.
Well, good thing on some of that, maybe just touch on another couple of items just briefly. AI, everybody's talking AI these days, of course. It's the headliner.
Well, actually, Eric's on vacation at the moment, and this is an AI version, so it's doing pretty well. I like it. Maybe I even like it better. I don't know.
So some data points that I picked up was that, they noted that most of the value in AI is accrued to the semiconductor companies, $130 billion related to AI. At the same time, the cloud companies are running at about a $20 billion annual run rate. So there's a lot going into building out these data centers. Saw an impressive demonstration of what Elon Musk did with his AI center there in Texas. But eventually, for this to be successful, the benefits of AI have to be delivered to the end market, right? And that's, I think, a bigger potential upside than what we've seen to this point. All the investment in data centers, they're doing it because they're expecting the end markets is going to drive some real value. And a lot of that's going to be on, has to be on various platforms. And I think not just our smartphones and our PCs. I think that there's opportunities for AI to penetrate all types of electronics equipment. And when we get that wave coming through, that we're kind of in the preparatory stages for it now with building out these data centers, that is part of what gives me optimism, I guess you could say, enthusiasm for the future, is that, there's a pony in there somewhere, as they say. There's got to be, some real results of all of this investment coming out. And one tantalizing thing out there is, we've all migrated to our smartphones, but now there's a potential Mark Zuckerberg is looking at smart glasses as being the next major compute platform. What does that world look like? As we get smart glasses working with smartphones, it's incredible what can potentially come out the other end of this in the longer term. So we've got the tougher situation we're in right now, but I think longer term, there's some real exciting opportunities there.
And it would be great to imagine that AI can help with that predictability of demand from a supply side in the industry, and can also help to perhaps create a better connection between the component industry and the EMS industry in terms of the supply chain. Having AI in that area would be useful, because it is a huge amount. There's a huge amount of data available, and actually processing that data and making sense out of it's really difficult.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
Hey, listen.
the smart glasses will bring a little bit of this into focus for us.
But it's interesting too, from a social thing. I hear a lot of the younger people are starting to turn away from smartphones. They are adopt them from themselves, but when they start talking, they're starting to become parents, and for their children, they're saying there's no way they're going to be on this, right? They don't want to pass along that addiction, so to speak, right? So I'm curious to see how that might play out. But listen, demand is, I think of two things here: the demand issue and the challenge, and kind of, how we do that. And that has a direct impact on the inventory overhang and the challenge that persists, right? If there were great demand, we would probably flush it all out pretty quickly, and a lot of these ills will go away. Jeff, you deal with a lot of EMS companies. You've spoken about that some. And then we've seen a lot of these new platforms come out purportedly to help deal with all this, excess inventory, and all these solutions are being brought to market to help with all this, right? So taking all that as is, how do you see, what would you advise for these EMS companies? What is the best way to manage their excess inventory issues?
Okay, so I'm gonna roll back a little bit to Dale's comment on date codes. And start from there to answer your question. So the ECIA actually has a nice white paper dealing with date codes. And so based upon the vertical, medical being probably the shortest, it's somewhere between 12 months and 18 months of date code restrictions, out to 2 years and normally even 3-year date code restrictions that are kind of superimposed by the EMS companies onto manufacturers or distribution alike. Now, I will tell you that we have OEMs that we deal with directly in my group, and deal with EMS that builds for that exact same OEM, and we get two different stories relative to date codes. So you have to take a little bit of it with a grain of salt. And so I think the first thing I do is I would encourage everybody to go back to when these date code restrictions were actually put in place. And you had heat and you had humidity in distribution centers. The distribution center in Fort Worth, Texas, that TT operates out of in the Americas, let's face it, that place is nicer than my house. So products being on the shelf in that type of controlled environment is far different than it was in the early 80s or in the 60s and 70s when some of these date code restrictions were brought into the industry. As we've met with people, and again, go back and utilize the white from ECIA, we like to coach our customers on what the real risks are associated with aged inventory. Now, mind you, if it's a 3-year date code, when we receive components from the original component manufacturer, they're all not, a born on date from that exact same month. So we're getting inventory that may be 3, 6, 9, maybe even a year old when we get it from the original component manufacturer over the last year to year and a half. So it's all not fresh inventory. Some of this inventory they brought back by their customers, and it's all authorized. So it's certainly certified product, but date codes are certainly going to be an issue that we're going to need to educate ourselves around and implement where it makes sense. Again, there are going to be some applications, particularly in medical, where we're just going to have to work with the constraints that are in there. But when it gets into the other applications, particularly outside of that segment, I think that we need to revisit it. But my advice would be to the contract manufacturers that are sitting on inventory is, clearly there's some liability and constraints that they have with their customers that they need to have some conversations around moving that inventory. Most of the customers that we're dealing with are not sitting on skids of inventory of components. They're bringing it in somewhat on a build cycle, where inventory that they're driving out, Eric, more today is actually in finished goods. So they're going ahead and running builds. And so from that standpoint, the product meets the date code requirements because it was inserted in the printed circuit board prior to any expiration dates that would have come in place. And then from there, but that does continue to drive their inventory numbers up. And this are impacts to their interest. Again, from a cash flow standpoint, those are goods that are tied up, finished goods that show up in their inventory, and again, paying interest on it as well. So we're not really seeing the contract manufacturers sitting on lots of inventory that could be outside of date code restrictions. We're really more seeing it on our shelves and how we're educating them to work through their end customers and where they might be from a finished goods standpoint.
Okay.
I think it's really interesting what you say there, Jeff, about, not all 12-month-old inventory being equal, and that's absolutely clearly the case. And, there has to be perhaps a reevaluation of what those expiry dates look like. Just as if you buy milk and you leave it out in Texas on the doorstep for a couple of days, it's not going to do so well as the milk in the fridge. So you've got to kind of consider that, and I think that's one of the areas that part inspection, often driven by AI and machine learning, can be valuable. maybe to help with the assessment of what the date code should really be, but also to actually validate parts as that are outside date code before they're used. But the industry has to have a complete understanding up and down the value chain to what that looks like and what is acceptable.
So we talk about AI, and it's a really big term. And so I think everybody has this one, application in their mind is what it really drives. And so if it's an app on a phone, as you mentioned earlier, not a lot of content in an app. So I'm not super excited about that. I do like the phone sales, but we were going to get the content from a phone regardless of an AI application driving an app. Where I think in machine to machine learning, some of the wearables and those applications, or what's going to drive. But you have the power generation side of the AI explosion. You also have the infrastructure side, so the chillers, the cooling, the HVAC pieces to keep, because of the heat and removal, or the power generation and the removal of the heat generated by these processors that are going by NVIDIA. I think so. There's more to it than just the kind of in the rack, if you will. And for us, as a distributor, we participate in all three segments, where it's power generation, the infrastructure that it takes inside the facility, or the smart buildings that these storage centers are in, and then certainly on the racks themselves from at a component level.
Yeah, and just briefly on that, sorry to interrupt again, Eric. Just briefly on that, we saw news this week, I think, that ARM are looking to enter that market, and NVIDIA might finally have a competitor. I mean, that'll obviously take time, but it really does show the value of that market and the exposure to a single player, and that's an interesting element to look at going forward.
Yeah. As I hear you talk, one of the big issues, and we talk about contract manufacturers, the trend has been, we've called it reshoring, nearshoring, all these things, but the desire to extract business out of China, have a China plus one, China plus two strategy for manufacturing. And then people say, yeah, but of course, but then we're still getting all our components from there, right? That's all being manufactured there still. So there's still that dependence. But I guess my question is, do you see any of that changing? Do you see that? I know that India has been pretty aggressive. The government has policies to help kind of, to grow the EMS industry, but also to grow the component side purportedly. Are either of you guys seeing or hearing anything with changes there?
Well, I think it's not change. I think it's a continuation. So the momentum and shift has happened. And let's face it, China is not the same country from a cost standpoint it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. And as for other reasons, the motivation has happened now to have a bifurcated strategy when it comes to your manufacturing, or an elimination strategy. It's just not going to build there at all. And India has certainly been a benefit, has benefited from that migration. Oddly enough, Malaysia, and I say oddly enough because it's not necessary, it's so developed. When you go into capacity, many of the contract manufacturers that are in Penang, as an example, they're kind of full. And so they're having to jettison out other programs to other lower cost areas. Vietnam is benefiting from it. Certainly Thailand is benefiting from it in Southeast Asia. Mexico clearly is becoming a reshoring back, particularly for North American OEMs, particularly automotive. I like to say if it weighs more than 200 pounds, get those applications back and take out some of the other cost driver elements around freight and logistics. And then in Europe, whether it be Poland, Romania, and even in North Africa, we're seeing companies go back into those regions, partly because of availability of capacity, partly because of availability of personnel, and then ultimately driven by cost. And so I'm not sure that once you have those changes, that it ever reverts back to the way that it was prior to that. And so I think we're seeing a lot of, maybe it was a year ago we had this call and we started talking about regionalization of of manufacturing, manufacturing in North America for North America, in Europe for Europe. I think what we're seeing now, even driven by things like ESG and emissions, that having the manufacturer of whatever component qualified for the builds in region is starting to be more and more of a trend because of the carbon responsibility, that's starting to play into it. And so I think that while the Chinese manufacturers will continue to source Chinese-made product, it's also going to be driven by those factors outside of it as well.
It's interesting you mentioned Malaysia. A few years back, I did a study looking at the import-export data to the U.S. for electronics components. And one of the things that was interesting to me is if you look at the imports of semiconductor chips, the source of those imports are dominated by shipments from Malaysia. And that's because all the packaging taking place there. It's not Taiwan, it's Malaysia. But, so Malaysia has these great capabilities. The other interesting thing, Mexico coming into play, the thing that's upsetting some people is China is now using Mexico as the back door to get around some of these restrictions on imports from China. And so there's going to be some more efforts made to manage that whole thing. That then you come to this whole issue, depending on what happens in the election, the issue of tariffs. Tariffs has not gone away. And our members, it continues to be a very active discussion on how they manage the tariffs. And, we could see it's possible, depending on, again, which administration is in power next year, there could be some big movements on tariffs that could, again, reshape where things are located and how the game is played, I guess you could say, in locating manufacturing. Then that just takes into one more thing that's a big deal for us, which is the restrictions, the BIS restrictions from the government, where you have to identify who you're working with and who you're shipping a component to. If you wind up shipping a component to somebody who's then, shipping it back to Russia or China, those penalties can be extremely painful. And so we're working actively with our members to help them, stay out of, the crosshairs of the Commerce Department and their enforcement of those export restrictions. So, this geopolitical environment that we're dealing with is it's a challenge, and it's not going to get any easier.
No, geopolitical volatility is something that we're having to deal with, and you're absolutely right. When I was at SMTA Guadalajara a couple of months ago, the only election talk was about potential tariffs and the idea that there might be tariffs. Tariffs are a concern that they will be on Europe into the US, but also, the thought that there might be tariffs on Mexico into the US is concerning that market. As you mentioned, Jeff, Mexico's had some great growth over the last couple of years, but it feels like it's a tiny bit of overcapacity at the moment. So the capex growth there has been particularly challenged this year, and probably will continue to be in the first half of next year because of that.
Agreed.
Hey, tell me.
And they want to know what the next administration will be. So
we'll know in a week. Well, maybe.
Yeah, well, maybe we will, Eric. Maybe we won't.
Maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, I'm just curious, since, from the DISTI perspective, with all of the pressures and with, the EMS, everything being tough, how is margin pressure within the industry? Is it making for some difficult, hard conversations? How are things there, Jeff?
Well, they're difficult and hard, but I don't know if it's actual conversation. It's a one-way communication. Yeah, without question. I mean, if you look at the EMS companies, they're operating on mid-single-digit margins, and manufacturers are continuing to get. So our sales come from our customers, but our margins come from our suppliers. And the suppliers have cost drivers, gold at all-time high. We talked about freight and logistics earlier, energy costs, labor costs, interest rates. So these are all things that are making it more and more difficult for manufacturers to afford any level of margin for distributors. So without question, payables are getting stretched out, which is cash flow. Margins are getting pressured from the manufacturers, are getting pushed down by the contract manufacturers because there haven't been price decreases that, normally you would think lead times coming down. Now, Dale pointed out, while they're down, they're not down below pre-pandemic levels, but anyway, you see lead times coming down and you're not getting downward pressure on pricing. So that is how contract manufacturers are competing against each other, is they're bidding for new logos that are actually out there and existing in the way that they're doing it. It is certainly putting even more price pressures, which is a margin erosion for anyone in the channel. So it is live. So our shrink from gross margin to net margin is as pronounced as it has ever been. And then there's a huge difference between gross margin and net margin.
Right.
I think one of the challenges there, Jeff, which is really interesting when you speak to the EMS customers on the other side of this, is, there's pressure in terms of margins for them. There's pressure in terms of margins at the distributor level and throughout. But there seems to be, in some ways, a little bit of a misunderstanding as to where the value is added in each part of the process, and that's made communication a little bit more difficult and a little bit more adversarial. And I think there's some work that needs to be done in improving that communication, and not just from company to company, but kind of overall, so the EMS industry understands better the huge value that good component distribution can add to their business, because what they've seen over the last few years is kind of has been pretty tough in terms of the supply chain, but also tough in terms of pricing moving not necessarily the way they would like or expect.
We like to talk it in terms of price in the door, but value is the component on the way out the door. And so there's certainly ways that we can partner with our EMS accounts to shoulder some of that burden, particularly on the financial side. And also from an original component manufacturer, many of them are going through product portfolio rationalizations, as well as our upstream OEMs are also evaluating which products do they want to continue to build and which products or assemblies that they want to outsource. And so I think that there's going to be some upside even in a flat market for the EMS customers, because their OEM upstream customers are really evaluating where do they want to put their resources and what kind of returns. And I was at a supplier conference here this week, and they talked in terms of outsourcing as much as 80% of the components that they currently manufacture. Now, it's not 80% of the dollars, don't misunderstand that, but where did they have space tied up? They have resources tied up. This is not necessarily their skill set. They're keeping some legacy products alive and starting to move those more and more toward contract manufacturing to build it to align their strategy, their resources with really the business that they're trying to drive. So I think that there's some opportunities in there, but you've got, to your point, Phil, you've got to focus on what value you're creating versus, as I like to say, having the lowest price at the fifth digit past the decimal. If that is your measure, then it's going to be tough sledding. You're going to have to find a way to have some kind of focus on something other than just the in the stock pricing levels.
And I think that the pandemic perhaps highlighted that. When we went through the pandemic and all the stresses on the channel, people began to realize that there are multiple elements of value, not just, as you say, pushing that last micro penny out of the price. There's many elements of the value that come into play that have to be assessed in that relationship.
Actually, I wanted to circle, Jeff, you made a comment there about coming out of China. Has there been any issue with overproduction? I mean, with prices not going down for components per se. Has there been any issue with overproduction out of China, out of some of these facilities? You read about that in some sectors, but I don't know how that goes to the electronic component piece.
Not significant enough to comment on. I mean, there's always a story here or a story there, but fundamentally, no.
Good. Fair enough then.
You know, one of the points I made in my presentation, though, is that China, with their own economic situation and the bust that they had in real estate, they're now putting this big emphasis on, you know, investment into manufacturing activities. And, you know, Jeff mentioned the struggles that Europe is having. And there was an article a while back that, you know, pointed out, you know, originally the US lost, of course, a lot of jobs as we outsourced so much production to China. Well, the impact on Europe of Chinese overproduction and export of that material, the impact could be an order of magnitude larger on Europe than it was on the US. And so, you know, Europe has many challenges ahead of it. You know, that China just compounds what they're facing.
Yeah, no question.
Good. Gentlemen, I want to be respectful of your time here. We said we try to keep this to 45 minutes, and we're kind of bumping into that ceiling right now. So let me just ask, I mean, you both have talked about your kind of forecast, but Dale, you did more of a forecast did you this with what you presented last week? But are you, it seems to be the general consensus here seems to be kind of second half of next year might be when things are coming. So how do you see kind of those tailwinds and headwinds kind of colliding, and, you know, where we're heading, and what's your sense of it?
Yeah, well, I have to be somewhat careful because as an industry association, I'm not allowed to forecast. So I have to keep myself out of trouble, but I can observe trends and look at how things might play out with the way historical trends play out. And one thing that I find, again, encouraging is that if we look at the current semiconductor cycle, you know, you think, oh, we think we might be reaching the peak, and we could be coming back down the backside of that peak. And actually, you know, that could play out, could be more of a concern in 2025 than, you know, reason for optimism. But we've had some cycles in the semiconductor industry where we've kind of had two peaks. We kind of pushed up to one level, then we had a pause in some of these cycles where we sorted out the inventory, and then we pushed to an eventual pure demand-driven peak. And I think we have that potential for that scenario to play out again in this cycle, with two things coming into play that I mentioned. One is getting this inventory challenge sorted out as we move into mid-2025. But then, as I also mentioned, some of these end market, not data center, but end market applications gaining traction with compelling capabilities that they will offer to businesses and consumers. That demand, combined with working out the inventory challenge, could move us and extend this cycle and move us up even higher than where we are currently, with the rising tide lifting more of the ships than just memory and logic. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's potential for a more encouraging outlook as we move into that second half of 2025.
Okay.
Same time frame though, which I think concurs with what a lot of the EMS companies believe, and kind of what Jeff was suggesting. But since Jeff started with wrong again as his opening comment,
yeah,
we've got to caveat that somewhat.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see the mood and the discussions at Electronica here that some of us are going to, right? That's always it'll be interesting.
It's a good weather vane, yeah.
It really is. It really is. So, gentlemen, thank you. This has been, as always, you both had great insight and kind of commentary, and help our audience to understand what's happening a lot better. So we appreciate that. We will see. I know, Jeff, I'll see you hopefully in Munich, and Phil, Dale, I don't know if you're you're not heading to Electronica. No, sir.
No.
Okay. Well, we'll toast you, and
you've got work to do here.
We'll raise a beer for you in Munich then, Dale.
Enjoy a bratwurst for me.
Very good. Thank you all very, very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, guys. Bye for now.